Okay, thank you. Uh, Good. Okay, so Mattia already gave a very good overview of sort of the larger Interreal project and the grand aims and lofty goals that we hope to aspire towards in the next 5 years as we continue with the project. But what my presentation will be focusing on is on a kind of a more focused subject, maybe a subset or a sub-question connected to some of the larger questions that we'll be exploring in the Interreal project, and that is the role and the effects of materiality in Interreal translations, in translations between virtual and physical spaces and states. So, as Mattia said and described just now, we are kind of in a very early stage of the process and of the project, and we've been sort of Mattia's been laying some of the theoretical groundwork for how we can proceed in conceptualizing and analyzing interreal translations. So the question now is, what should we do next? What should we do next in a sort of a theoretical sense, in addition to the analytical and the other aspects of the project that we'll be pursuing. So theoretically, I think, or we think, there are basically two big questions on our minds at the moment. One is something that Mattia already sort of touched on in his presentation, and that is the sort of semiotic mechanics or the semiotic functioning of alternate realities, and exactly how exactly do they function in semiotic terms? How do we engage with them as semiotic systems? And that's something that has been explored to some extent, but that still requires further exploration as we move on with the project. And then another question, a sort of a related question, or as maybe the same question but from a different perspective, would be to ask how do virtual spaces and um, different kinds of states of existence thought of as alternate realities, how do they function in material terms? How do they function in relation to the sort of physical, quote unquote, real world, and how do they relate to it? And these are interconnected questions, and exploring one question will complement investigations of the other question. We have already done some investigations of alternate realities in semiotic terms, and now one of the interesting things to do would be to focus on the material side and sort of um, try to bring some sense into our understanding of how exactly do these realities exist and function in terms of their material aspects and their relation to the material world. So, if we start thinking about the questions related to the materiality of alternate realities or the material concerns in interreal translation, some questions come to mind immediately. One question might be about the material characteristics of different realities. How exactly do they exist in material terms? What kind of material characteristics do they inhabit or employ? What kinds of material interactions or transfers take place between alternate realities, between the physical world and between different virtual spaces? Um, the big question, what can we learn by viewing these exchanges as translation? What does the conceptual lens of translation or of translation studies give us when we look at these exchanges as interreal translations? And then from the other side, what does the study of interreal translations bring to translation studies? And specifically, what does the study of the material aspects of interreal translations bring to translation studies? And um how we are approaching these questions at the moment is from a combination of two perspectives. It is with a sort of a post-digital approach to media and with a material approach to translation. And I'll go through what exactly I mean by these in just a moment. The notion of post-digital of the post-digital condition or a post-digital approach to media is kind of a reaction to these sort of very common discursive tactics or discursive elements used in discussions of digital media, which kind of tend to emphasize the sort of non-material, so to say, non-material aspects of digital media, that emphasize the ways in which digital media and digital texts exist at a kind of a step removed from matter, or at least from specific instances of materiality. So they're not kind of they're treated as kind of an abstract projection that is that kind of has an illusion of immaterial behavior in that digital texts are manipulated and engaged with as sets of symbols rather than material inscriptions. When you engage with a digital text, you're not engaging with a specific material instance of the text, a specific material exemplar of the text. You're engaging with it um, through a technology that allows you to sort of manipulate it on and engage with it on the level of symbols, removed from any specific material instance of it. So um, this is the kind of kind of prevalent way of thinking of and talking about digital texts. But what the post-digital understanding of media sort of does in relation to or in retaliation to that is that it kind of has made note of an emerging shift in how we how we engage with digital texts that signifies a sort of a shift away from the symbolic as the sort of preferred mode of digital systems. Because what the sort of main point of the post-digital approach is that the digital is necessarily embedded in the analog. And that means that the sort of assumed immateriality of the digital is illusory, really. It is a fact that the sort of symbolic layer with which we manipulate and engage with digital text, it is a kind of a projection, an abstract projection in a sense. It is true that we can manipulate uh, digital texts on a kind of a symbolic level, on the level of symbols, removed from specific inscriptions or specific material instances of the text. They are kind of modular or adaptable in that sense, thanks to the kind of technological nature that they're based on. But still, that projection, that projected layer on which we engage with them, that is grounded in materiality and that is supported by concrete materiality, by physical materiality. And that means that uh, when we engage with the kind of symbols and the symbolic layer uh, that is so prevalent in digital text, or that is the sort of the main way with which we engage with digital text. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that we do it in material environments, and the sort of symbolic layer intermingles with other forms of meaning making when we do it, because the digital is not just digital; it is also um, grounded in analog experiences and analog technologies. So when we sort of move from a general media discussion to specifically talking about translation phenomena from a post-digital perspective, I think we can see a lot of interesting questions and interesting issues that rise from that and that kind of support this kind of approach to digital media uh, because the sort of post-digital approach, it leads to a kind of blurring of boundaries between physical and digital textualities and between symbols and between other meaningful textual aspects because it is based very strongly on the idea that we cannot make a strict separation between digital text and digital symbols that exist in a digital void or or an immaterial digital state. They are necessarily connected to physical and analog and experiential embodied ways of engaging with texts. Uh, and in a sense, the kind of all kinds of engagement with digital text, or even the very existence of digital text, they depend on various forms of analog to digital and digital to analog translations. You know, we engage with digital texts in through our analog senses, uh, through our physical bodies and our physical sensory experiences. To name just one example, I mean they are very thoroughly embedded in analog states and physical in physical existence. And I've been reading the book on the very recent book on hypertranslation with some interest, and I think that comes to a kind of a very similar it comes from a very similar place and represents a similar ethos, I suppose, in that in that book as well. The translation is kind of described as a this kind of a constant process of and constant movement across boundaries that are getting increasingly blurred and that even dissolve into non-existence. Um, and that includes barriers between the material and the virtual, or between digital and physical states and digital and physical texts. So I think there's a lot of translation theoretical discourse going on that also provides a some points of connection to these kinds of concerns. And one of those, one additional translation theoretical theme that connects to that connects to um, these discussions is the concept of materiality in translation. Um, and I think the sort of material approach or material understanding of translation really supports a post-digital understanding of digital media because the sort of main thrust of the material perspective to translation is to recognize the material realities of textual communication and the fact that the science, um, linguistic science or other kinds of science that are utilized in textual communication, they always employ a material medium of some kind, and that's required for the purposes of text being received and being interpreted. And this sort of framework, it implies a further need to focus on the situated and the embodied perspective of the actor that's interpreting the science, the receiver of the text, because all kind of textual engagement takes place through material media, through the recognition of material forms as meaningful expressions, and therefore through sensory engagement and embodied engagement with material texts. But also, like I said, on the act of sensory engagement with the textual aspects that are experienced as meaningful. So not just on the symbols that are sort of included or communicated by the text, but also the full gamut of physical embodied sensory experience that you have when reading the text or engaging with the text. Uh, and this means that when we bring a material focus to these discussions, we can bring some nuance to the sort of existing discourse on digital text, which is often predicated on these kinds of assumptions about digital textuality um, that emphasize or overemphasize the predominance of these sort of um, non-physical or symbolic aspects of digital textuality. Just, acknowledging that in addition to the sort of in addition to the sort of symbolic layer, the sort of in addition to engaging with the content, quote unquote, content of the text, there are for example, iconic kinds of meaning making taking place because we perceive the certain material forms in texts as characters, as uh, expressions, as gestures, as figures, as whatever. That's an iconic process. Um, and also indexical forms of meaning making because we recognize traces of media or text production tools in our texts when we engage with them, and that also that um, affects our meaning making from those texts. So all these kinds of different forms of meaning making intermingle and are enmeshed and bundled up in complex webs when we engage with different kinds of text, including digital text. And that means translation too. It does not take place just on the level of symbols, or level of content, and we all know this, I'm sure, but it also involves iconic concerns, indexical concerns, all kinds of uh, forms of meaning making, textual meaning making have to be taken into account in translation processes. And this, following those post-digital principles that I explored earlier, these aspects, they're just as relevant to these kind of new digital media as they are to physical media and to material environments as well as to virtual environments. They apply just as well to text that we engage with through computers and through VR headsets or through our smartphones as they apply to text that we engage with on ink and paper or in or by sound and so forth. So if we take all this and start to think about the kinds of interreal phenomena that Mattia also described in his presentation, um, we can kind of start to reconsider our the sort of many of the sort of prevalent assumptions about um, what virtual spaces are and how they exist in the physical world. Because this sort of discourse or this sort of assumption that virtual text, virtual spaces are sort of predominantly immaterial or entirely immaterial in how they lend themselves to this kind of symbol level manipulation removed from specific instances of textual materiality or specific material inscriptions of the symbols. Um, that idea is a very common framing for why we should utilize virtual technologies or VR technologies in certain situations, and it's also used as a tactic in sort of proliferating this technology. And one example of this is digital twins, which Mattia mentioned already a little bit, on which I'll be going into a little bit more detail here. Digital twins, they're reproductions of physical infrastructures or buildings or objects or whatever, machines maybe, that enable these infrastructures to be tested, to be studied, to be analyzed, uh, without engaging with the specific material um, instance of the machine or of the structure that you want to study. And also, as is often used as a kind of a reason to utilize these digital twins. One aspect of them is that because they exist in these kinds of digital spaces and they can be engaged with in these purely digital forms, they don't have the kind of environmental impact that the same operations would have in the real world. So instead of testing the same machine in five different places and carrying the machine there to these five different places, or making five versions of the same machine and and shipping them to these five different places. All these places can just use the digital twin of the machine and try it out and then see how it works. So that's of course an environmentally friendlier way of testing these machines. And one example that I have here is just to as an illustrative example is an application called Mini Tokyo 3D, which is a digital replication of the sort of central areas of the city of Tokyo, and specifically its public transport routes, which you can follow and manipulate in these virtual spaces. And it kind of replicates them in real time, and you can analyze how they work and so forth. So that's a digital replication of a real world infrastructure that allows you to engage with it to engage with and analyze the real world structure in a purely digital form. And it's kind of easy to then follow that to the conclusion that because it's this kind of virtual immaterial space, what I'm doing is I'm manipulating symbols. I'm engaging with it on a symbolic level. And it is removed from the specific instance of the city of Tokyo as it exists in the real world. So my manipulation of it on a symbolic, immaterial level, surely that doesn't have any material consequences. But I mean, as you can maybe guess, the sort of material post-digital perspective would suggest otherwise. And again, that goes back to the idea that the space itself, it is a virtual space. It is this kind of abstract projection, as mentioned, but it is projected and maintained with and accessed through material technologies. So you need a computer, you need a smartphone, you need a VR headset, or something like that. Um, and when you access them through these technologies, when you access these digital structures through these technologies, what you're accessing is a virtual environment that doesn't exist as such in physical reality, but the technology required to project them does. The technologies that you use to access them and the sort of computers and servers and everything like that that requires to upkeep them, those all exist in material reality. And that is where the material consequences of this engagement with these quote unquote immaterial symbolic structures exists. The structures themselves may not have um, the kind of environmental impact, for example, as the actual structures have. The virtual structures don't have the kind of environmental impact that the physical structures have, but they have their own kind of environmental impact. They have the environmental impact of the technologies required to access them and the technology required to upkeep them. And that's sort of something that these sort of digital twin projects struggle with, because they're one of their key reasons for existing is the sort of their environmental um, environmental the sort of lesser degree of environmental impact that they have. But at the same time, they have to be aware of the environmental impact that they do have, which is just kind of a different kind of impact than the actual physical structures do have. And then another thing that has to be considered is that the sort of technological medium that we use to engage with these texts, it has its own material concerns that it raises in terms of access and in terms of engagement with the text. There's a certain financial cost often to engaging with these texts. You're not just you can't just directly uh, take in the text. You need to have a specific kind of mediatory technology to access it. Um, and that means that the technology that you need to access text may have certain requirements for sensory ability, for example, that not everyone may have. There are questions of accessibility in terms of the sort of visual nature of VR, for example. Can everyone access these kinds of texts because they are accessed visually? No, they can't. And that's an issue for these kinds of texts because the technologies often don't allow different kinds of engagement than with the sort of than the one they're designed for. And there are ease of use questions. Can, everyone, they are very involved technologies often. Not everyone can use them, has the know-how to use them. And all of this brings further semiotic concerns into play, uh, in addition to just what is the textual content being engaged with here in a symbolic sense. Uh, One of these aspects is what I just mentioned, is the technology that's required to access virtual content. They are often very obvious technologies. Sometimes they're even encumbering in a sense. For example, like if I use my smartphone to access an augmented reality app like the IKEA sofa application, for example, that was mentioned, it is very obvious to me that I am accessing it through a technological medium. It is even more obvious often if I'm using a very clunky VR headset on my head that I'm using to access otherwise an otherwise immersive space. But because these technologies are such an obvious presence that calls an attention to the mediatory layers that are present in my sensory experience, and that affects my immersion, that affects my meaning making from these texts. And that is an indexical form of meaning making. That is a trace of the medium in the text, and that is an indexical effect uh, beyond the sort of symbolic content being engaged with. And then there's the nature of these texts as virtual texts, as digital programs. That brings in another thing to consider, and that is that the the way these texts function on a program level, when I engage with these texts, I'm not engaging with them directly on the program level. I am accessing and manipulating them through this kind of presentational level layer or representational layer that is created sort of on top of the program layer, that is interpretable to me, that is understandable to me as a human user, because it replicates the sort of visual or spatial or whatever aspects of the physical structures that I am that are being replicated in the virtual space, just without their actual physicality. So, for example, in the Tokyo example, that's I'm not in, when I look at how a commuter train is going from the south of Tokyo to the north of Tokyo, I'm not looking at the program directly. I'm not looking at the actual functioning of the text. I'm looking at a further layer of representation on top of its sort of program level functioning. And that is something that's being created specifically as something that I understand and as something that I can recognize with as a specific kind of structure in the real world. And that is an iconic relation between the sort of between the analog, the physical forms, and the digital forms that I'm engaging with. So as you can see, there are a lot of different kinds of meaning making taking place when we engage with these kinds of um, digital texts. So with all that in mind, if we go back to our questions that I started with, what are the material characteristics of these different realities? What are the kinds of material interactions or transfers that take place between them? What can we learn from these exchanges by viewing them as translation? And what does the study of interreal translations and the study of materiality in interreal translations bring to translation studies? Um, these are and remain good questions, and I'm not sure if we have quite answered them yet, but just to kind of go through our initial thoughts on these, I think the least we can say about the first question, what are the sort of material characteristics of these different realities? The least we can say is that at least virtual realities are not immaterial. That is not the defining characteristic of virtual realities. Virtual spaces and virtual structures, they are projected, upkept, maintained by material technologies. They are accessed via physical media, and they are interpreted through embodied sensory experience. So they're always rounded in materiality and the material reality when they're engaged with. And as for the sort of material interactions that take place between different kinds of realities, well, if virtual spaces are not immaterial spaces, then transfers from the physical world to virtual worlds are not transfers from material to immaterial states, even if it might be, it is in sort of layman's terms or in common discourse, that's the sort of leap that's often taken or the assumption that's often made. There are always material concerns in play, and they always affect the production of virtual text, the mediation of those texts, and the reception of text in virtual environments. So, what then can we learn from these exchanges by viewing them as translation? Well, like Mattia also said, if we sort of consider translation a bold metaphor for interreal exchanges, then we can use translation concepts to sort of explicate the strategies that are utilized in the creation of interreal translations and also the constraints that are faced in the creation of interreal translations. We can sort of explore with this kind of material focus, we can explore the full complexity of all kinds of meaningful relations that exist between different kinds of realities, not just in terms of content, symbolic content that's being replicated, but also iconic, indexical, all kinds of all forms of meaning making that come into play when we consider the material aspects as well as the digital or virtual aspects. And then on the other side, what does the study of materiality in interreal translations and the study of interreal translation in general, what does that bring to translation studies? Well, in a very kind of an obvious sense, interreal translation as a concept, it expands the scope of translation studies to areas that maybe it didn't have concepts to engage with previously. And it can expand the concepts of translation studies and the methods of translation studies to these kinds of virtual spaces, augmented realities, as an emerging medium of textual engagement and as a medium and a form of textuality that's becoming more and more prevalent and more important. And at the same time, when we research interreal translations and when we research interreal exchanges as forms of translation, that furthers our understanding of materiality in translation. Because it allows us to compare this kind of analog and digital textualities, and that allows us to study how source side material features are replicated or hidden or circumvented in these sort of target virtual structures, or vice versa? How do we create physical versions of virtual structures or virtual objects, or how do different kinds of virtual spaces recreate the same objects or spaces or actors? And hopefully these insights can then be applied to other kinds of translation and other forms of textuality. So sort of complementing and strengthening and expanding on our understanding of all kinds of translation, not just interreal translation. But really, honestly, the question to all of these questions, the answer to all of these questions at the moment is we don't know yet. This is a very early days in a very long project with million things to consider and a lot of different kinds of things to think about. So um, these are just some initial ideas. We have a very good plan for the project that Natia has described, but what exactly how exactly we should engage with these specific questions that are related to it. A lot of these are open questions still, and we would be very happy to hear your comments and feedback on either specifically on this material side, but just in general on the sort of conceptual side of interreal translations. Right. Thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you very much